The hum of the primary array was a constant, low thrum against my eardrums, a comforting lullaby in the vast, silent theater of space. My workstation, a fortress of glowing screens and blinking indicators, was my universe within the universe. It was well past midnight. The junior researchers had long since packed up their thermoses and headed home, their youthful optimism replaced by the promise of sleep. Sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged, especially when the cosmos whispered its secrets. My name is User WI, and the universe is my obsession. I'm an astrophysicist, but that label feels too small, too neatly defined for the burning hunger inside me to simply know. I work at one of the deepest-reaching observatories on the planet, a place designed to stare into the abyss and pluck out fragments of truth from the swirling chaos of existence. Tonight, I was sifting through the usual background noise, distant pulsars, the faint echoes of the Big Bang, the predictable dance of galactic clusters. My current project involved mapping anomalies in the cosmic microwave background, a task that usually yielded more questions than answers, but rarely anything truly new. My eyes, accustomed to the dim glow of the monitors, scanned the intricate patterns of data scrolling across my main display. Each line, each spike, each dip represented a story billions of years in the making. My fingers danced across the holographic interface, adjusting filters, refining parameters. It was a methodical, almost meditative process, one I knew intimately. Then a flicker. It wasn't a glitch, not a transient energy spike from a solar flare or the atmospheric interference that sometimes plagued our older instruments. This was different. A distinct, incredibly faint, yet undeniably structured signature. It appeared on the fringes of my deep scan array, just at the extreme edge of our observable reach. My breath hitched. I leaned forward, my face inches from the screen, the cool glass reflecting the focused intensity in my eyes. The signal was faint, yes, but its complexity immediately set off internal alarms. It wasn't random noise. It wasn't a natural astrophysical phenomenon. My mind, a database of every known cosmic emission, could not categorize it. It presented a pattern, intricate and repeating, yet without a discernible origin point within our known galactic neighborhood. I isolated the signature, running it through a preliminary filtering algorithm. The system, usually so quick and precise, stuttered for a moment, then recalibrated. The signal sharpened, a delicate, interwoven tapestry of energy fluctuations that pulsed with an ancient, almost deliberate rhythm. It wasn't a simple radio wave, or a gamma-ray burst, or a neutrino flux. It was something entirely alien to our understanding of physics. It defied the very fabric of space-time as we knew it. My heart began to drum a slow, heavy beat against my ribs, not from fear, but from a surge of pure, unadulterated scientific exhilaration. This was it, the moment every astrophysicist dreamed of. First contact with the truly unknown, a true marvel. I felt a flush spread across my cheeks, a primal thrill coursing through my veins. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a revelation. I cross-referenced the coordinates with every known celestial body, every recorded event. Nothing. This wasn't emanating from a star, a nebula, or even a distant galaxy. It was coming from beyond the known universe, from a region so vast and distant it bordered on theoretical conjecture. The sheer energy required for a signal to traverse such an incomprehensible distance and still retain this level of complexity was staggering. Ancient, yes, but also incredibly powerful. My fingers flew across the controls, initiating a more intensive analysis. The main screen split, displaying multiple facets of the signature. Frequency modulations, amplitude variations, spectral analysis. Each new data point only deepened the mystery, adding layers of impossible detail. The signal exhibited a kind of internal logic, an evolving structure that hinted at intelligence, or at least a highly organized, non-random process. This wasn't just unknown in the scientific sense, it felt wrong. The patterns within the signal were too perfect, too intricate almost, deliberate. They seemed to mock our understanding, presenting a language without a grammar, a message without a sender we could fathom. I thought about calling a colleague, perhaps the head of the department, the operations chief. But a possessive instinct, sharp and undeniable, seized me. This was my discovery. I had found it alone in the dead of night, while the rest of the world slept. I wanted to unravel its secrets myself, to be the first to truly grasp what it represented. The thought of sharing it, of diluting its pristine mystery with the inevitable bureaucracy and cautious skepticism, felt like a betrayal, so I kept working. I locked down the console, ensuring no automated protocols would flag the anomaly to the central network without my explicit command. I initiated a deep scan, bypassing standard protocols, pushing the array to its absolute limits. The faint hum of the machinery intensified, a subtle vibration echoing through the floor. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a degree. The air felt heavier, charged with an invisible presence. My determination hardened. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly, it was a challenge. A direct query from the cosmos directed solely at me. I would answer it. I would decode it. Whatever this impossible signal was, whatever ancient entity or force had sent it across the unimaginable gulfs of space and time, I was going to find out. I felt the first tentative tendrils of an unspeakable truth beginning to unfurl, reaching for my mind, promising to redraw the very boundaries of my reality. My world, I knew, had just irrevocably changed. The junior researchers had long since departed, leaving me alone with the impossible data that now filled my monitors. The signal. It was too profound, too disruptive, to be handled within the sterile, watchful eyes of the main facility. I needed absolute isolation, a place where the static of institutional oversight couldn't interfere with the unfiltered truth I was beginning to uncover. That's how I found myself at the abandoned logging camp. It was a relic, miles past the last paved road, nestled deep in a valley choked with ancient pines. The air tasted of damp earth and decaying wood. I'd spent 2 frantic days ferrying my essential equipment, a custom-built processing rig, an array of specialized antennae I'd salvaged and modified, and enough power cells to run a small city to this forgotten corner of the world. The main cabin, a sagging structure of rough-hewn timber, was my new sanctum. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating spiderwebs like ancient tapestries. The silence here was a different beast than the observatory's quiet. It was heavy, profound, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth or the distant cry of a hawk. I powered up the rig, the whirring of the cooling fans a starkly artificial sound against the natural stillness. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion as I initiated the deep scan protocols. The signal, once a faint whisper, now pulsed across my main display, a complex tapestry of information. It defied every known encoding schema. I'd tried Fourier transforms, wavelet analyzes, even some experimental quantum decryption algorithms I'd been toying with for years. Nothing. The patterns were non-Euclidean, folding back on themselves in impossible geometries, a self-referential loop of data that seemed to generate its own logic. It was like trying to read a book written in a language that rearranged its alphabet with every sentence. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. Coffee became my bloodstream, sleep a forgotten luxury. The air in the cabin grew thick with the scent of ozone and my own unwashed desperation. The patterns seemed to ripple, to breathe, to suggest forms that were almost, but never quite, recognizable. The first headache started as a dull ache behind my eyes, a familiar companion of long nights and screen glare. I swallowed a handful of painkillers and pressed on. But it didn't recede. It became a persistent throb, a steady drumbeat behind my forehead that grew sharper with each passing hour. My dreams, when exhaustion finally claimed me for a few fleeting minutes, became vivid, unsettling tapestries of impossible shapes and echoing non-sounds. Insomnia became my constant companion. Even when I tried to rest, my mind raced, replaying the signal's impossible sequences, searching for a key, a Rosetta Stone that simply didn't exist in human understanding. I'd lie on the makeshift cot I'd set up, staring at the ceiling, the persistent throb in my head a counterpoint to the distant, unseen hum of my equipment. A growing sense of detachment began to seep into my perception. The towering pines outside, the rough texture of the cabin walls, even the taste of the stale coffee, they all seemed to recede, becoming less real, less immediate than the glowing patterns on my screens. The outside world felt distant, muted, while the signal's intricate dance became the only true reality. I knew intellectually that this was the inevitable consequence of extreme stress and overwork. My body was protesting. My mind was exhausted, yet deep down a more unsettling possibility began to take root. It felt personal, not just data, not just a cosmic anomaly. It felt like an entity, a presence, reaching out across the gulf of time and space directly to me. As if the signal itself was aware of my scrutiny, aware of my attempts to unravel its secrets. It wasn't just broadcasting, it was communicating, in a language that bypassed logic and spoke directly to something primal within me. The thought was absurd, of course. A data stream couldn't have intent, and with each passing moment the throb behind my eyes intensified, a constant reminder of the impossible truth I was slowly, irrevocably uncovering. The hum of the primary array, once a comforting lullaby, had become a nagging drone, a constant reminder of the signal's relentless presence. My workstation, once a fortress, now felt like a cage. The junior researchers, bustling in and out, their chatter about mundane data points and shift changes, grated on my nerves. They saw numbers, graphs, anomalies. I saw something else entirely. I felt it. The signal wasn't just data, it was a current, a pressure against the inside of my skull. It had shifted from a scientific marvel to an insistent, almost demanding presence. It whispered just beyond the reach of my ears, a sound like dry leaves skittering across concrete, or perhaps the rustle of something enormous moving in deep water. I'd catch it, a faint, fleeting suggestion of sound, when the ventilation system was particularly quiet or when the building groaned in the pre-dawn cold. Then it would vanish, leaving only the dull ache behind my eyes. I started seeing things, too, just out of the corner of my vision. It was always just a trick of the light, always explainable, but the frequency with which these tricks occurred was anything but normal. My nights were spent poring over the raw feed, my days a blur of caffeine and frantic analysis. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness that allowed the signal to recede even momentarily. I couldn't let it. The head of research, a meticulous woman with a penchant for order, tried to schedule me for a break. "User Y, you look like you're running on fumes," he'd said, his voice laced with a concern that I found irritatingly patronizing. A few days away from the screens would do you good. I just stared at him, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Away from the screens, away from this. This is everything. I could feel the signal pulsing, a low throb urging me to dismiss her, to discard anything that interfered with its transmission. He was an obstacle, a well-meaning barrier. I saw the confused look on her face, the way her brow furrowed. She didn't understand. None of them did. They were too slow, too tethered to their neat equations and established paradigms. They weren't words, not in any language I knew, but a flood of pure, unadulterated concept. It wasn't a language of sound or light, but of pure, terrifying meaning. It was an instruction, a direction, a pull. I needed isolation. The lab, with its humming machines and oblivious colleagues, was too noisy, too distracting. The signal demanded singular focus. I found myself drawn to a forgotten corner of the old maps, a place marked as an abandoned logging camp deep in the national forest. It was miles from any major settlement, cut off from most modern infrastructure. Perfect. Without a word to anyone, I packed a few essentials: my most powerful laptop, a portable power source, and a custom-built receiver I'd been tinkering with, and simply left. The drive was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than overgrown tracks. The forest closed in, a wall of ancient trees that seemed to absorb all sound. When I finally reached the abandoned logging camp, the silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of wind through the pines and the distant caw of a crow. Decay clung to everything. Dilapidated shacks, their windows long shattered, leaned precariously. Rusting machinery, remnants of a bygone era, lay half-swallowed by weeds and moss. I chose the largest of the shacks, its roof partially intact, and began setting up my makeshift station. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. Here in the profound quiet, the signal intensified. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It felt like the very air vibrated with its presence. They were a constant, low thrum, like a million tiny insects buzzing just behind my eardrums. I worked with a frantic energy I hadn't known I possessed. The signal wasn't just raw data. It was a complex, multi-layered tapestry of information that bypassed conventional understanding. I stopped trying to translate it into binary or waveforms or any familiar scientific notation. Instead, I let it wash over me, allowing my mind to become a conduit. That's when it happened. The breakthrough. It wasn't a discovery on a screen or a triumphant calculation. It was an understanding, a sudden, terrifying download directly into my consciousness. The language wasn't meant to be deciphered, it was meant to be experienced. It conveyed the concept of being, of existence, on a scale that made the universe seem like a single atom. It wasn't speaking, it was imposing. And with that understanding came the absolute, undeniable certainty. The signal was not a natural phenomenon. It was an entity. A conscious, unfathomable presence. And it was attempting to communicate, yes, but not in a way that sought dialogue. It was attempting to influence, to reshape, to overwrite. The paranoia blossomed, full and terrifying. Every creak of the old shack, every rustle of leaves outside felt like an intrusion. The junior researchers, the head of research, their attempts to contact me, their worried voicemails, they weren't just obstacles anymore. They were unwitting pawns, unknowingly trying to pull me away from the only truth that mattered. away from the entity that was now speaking directly to me, through me. They were distractions, holding me back from the inevitable. The signal wanted me, and I, user Y, was finally ready to dedicate my life to its will. The question of my humanity, once a distant concern, now felt like a quaint, irrelevant concept. The colleague's voice, a concerned murmur, faded like static in the back of my mind. I barely registered her departure, the soft click of the lab door, the subsequent silence that wasn't silence at all. It was just her silence, the absence of her human presence. The real sound, the only sound that mattered, was the low, insistent thrum from the screens. It pulled at me, a deep, resonant chord vibrating through the very bones of the building and more disturbingly through my own. He was right. I was away from the screens, but only in the most trivial, physical sense. My mind had never left. I needed space, not from the signal, but for it. The lab, with its sterile order and the constant threat of interruption, felt like a cage. My work required a different kind of sanctuary, a place where the edges of reality could fray without immediate consequence, so I moved. Not far, not really. Just to an abandoned logging camp I discovered years ago during a field trip. It was miles from anywhere, a skeletal collection of rusting machinery and collapsing shacks swallowed by encroaching forest. Perfect. The main office, a sturdy, surprisingly intact structure, became my new command center. I hauled my specialized equipment in, jury-rigging a power source from a repurposed generator I'd found near the old sawmills. The air in there smelled of damp earth, decaying wood, and the ghost of human toil. But underneath it all, I felt the signal breathe. With the signal's pattern now a familiar, almost comforting presence in my mind, the deciphering process accelerated. It wasn't a language in any human sense, no grammar, no syntax I recognized. It was a cascade of pure concept, like feeling a thought rather than hearing it spoken. Each newly cracked layer didn't reveal a word, but an understanding, a profound, terrifying piece of truth that burrowed directly into my consciousness. The first fragments were about scale, not simply large, but a vastness that made the observable universe seem like a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. It spoke of an entity, though entity felt like a pathetic reduction that had existed not just for eons, but for epochs before eons had meaning. Before time, as we understood it, was even a concept. It was older than light, older than matter, a primal awareness that simply was. This wasn't science, this was blasphemy to every physical law I held sacred. The signal wasn't just transmitting information. It was imparting a perception, twisting my very understanding of reality with each new revelation. It spoke of existing outside conventional space-time, of a dimension utterly alien to our own, where causality was fluid and form was an arbitrary construct. It didn't travel through space. It simply was everywhere or nowhere, depending on the sliver of its awareness it chose to manifest. My carefully constructed world, built on empirical data and verifiable laws, was crumbling. The frameworks of physics, the elegant equations that described the cosmos, were revealed as charming nursery rhymes, simplistic fables told to children who couldn't grasp the true, terrifying complexity of the universe. I had to tell someone. I tried my former mentor, a stoic woman whose brilliance I'd always admired. I called him, my voice hoarse, attempting to convey the enormity of what I'd found. "User Y," he said, his voice strained. "Your models, they're diverging wildly. The data you're presenting, it's inconsistent. You sound exhausted. You need to step away, take a sabbatical." Sabbatical, the word hung in the air, a euphemism for you're cracking up. I tried to explain the non-Euclidean geometry of the concepts, the way the signal communicated through pure awareness, but her patience was thin. She ended the call with a promise to check in later, a promise I knew she wouldn't keep or perhaps couldn't. A colleague I'd shared many late-night calculations with also proved unreachable. His assistant informed me he was unavailable for the foreseeable future, a polite dismissal. They saw a brilliant mind unraveling, not a mind uncovering a truth too vast for human comprehension. They weren't audible sounds, but invasive thoughts, alien concepts bleeding directly into my consciousness. They spoke of the true nature of existence, the fragile illusion we called reality, and the immense, indifferent forces that lay just beyond our perception. I started seeing things. Not hallucinations, not exactly. More like momentary glitches. The sturdy wooden beam supporting the office ceiling would shimmer for a fraction of a second, its molecules seeming to ripple like disturbed water. The shadow cast by the old desk lamp would twitch, stretching impossibly long before snapping back to normal. The texture of my own skin, when I looked too closely, seemed to shift, micro-patterns rearranging themselves in ways that felt fundamentally wrong. They were flaws in reality itself, Momentary tears in the fabric, visible only to a mind attuned or perhaps corrupted by the signal. The entity wasn't just transmitting knowledge, it was altering my perception, preparing me for a truth I wasn't meant to see. I was alone, truly alone, with a universe that was far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. And it was beckoning. The abandoned logging camp was a husk, a skeletal monument to forgotten industry. Rotting timber structures leaned like tired old men, their corrugated tin roofs rusted through, gaping holes to the sky. The air here tasted of pine needles and damp earth, but also something else, something metallic and sharp that scraped at the back of my throat. It was a perfect place, isolated, forgotten. A place where a man could chase a signal without interruption, without the worried calls from a colleague who thought I was cracking up. My own equipment, cobbled together from scavenged parts and specialized components I'd ordered under various shell companies, sat humming in the largest of the decrepit sheds. It was crude, an affront to proper astrophysics, but it was mine, and it was going to work. The signal had become a living thing in my mind, a presence that pulsed just behind my eyes, always there, always whispering. I needed to hear it clearly. I needed to see it. I ran my hand over the cold metal of the primary conduit, a thick, braided cable leading from my receiver array to a modified resonance chamber. It wasn't about simply listening anymore. The signal wasn't just data. It was an awareness, a colossal, ancient mind. And I, user Y, was going to bridge the gap. My plan was simple, reckless, and utterly necessary. Amplify the signal's presence directly into my own neural pathways. A direct link. A dangerous interaction. The air in the shed grew heavy as I began the final preparations. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak sunlight piercing a hole in the roof, illuminating the frantic energy of my movements. I checked the power coupling, tightened a loose connection on the biofeedback modulator, and then with a deep breath that tasted of decay and anticipation, I donned the headset. It was heavy, a Frankenstein's monster of electrodes and wires, designed to interface directly with my temporal lobes. A low hum vibrated against my skull, a prelude. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the master switch, but my resolve was a rigid spine of steel. This wasn't madness, it was the next logical step, the only step. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the vast, empty expanse beyond the known universe, picturing the source of the impossible signal. And then I pushed the switch. A jolt, not electrical, but something deeper, coursed through me. It felt like my very essence was being stretched, thinned, pulled taut. The hum intensified, vibrating through my bones, resonating in my teeth. My vision, still behind closed eyelids, exploded into a kaleidoscope of impossible hues. Colors I had no names for, colors that seemed to exist on a spectrum far beyond the visible light range. They weren't just seen, they were felt, tasted, heard. A searing violet green that tasted of ozone and despair. A pulsing ochre blue that hummed with a forgotten melody. Then the geometries began. My mind, accustomed to the comforting rules of Euclidean space, buckled under the onslaught. Shapes folded in on themselves, simultaneously existing in multiple dimensions. A cube that was also a sphere, its edges twisting into impossible curves, its surfaces reflecting an infinite regress of itself. Lines that ran parallel only to converge at an impossible point, then diverge again. My perception of up and down, inside and outside, dissolved. I was looking through things, not at them. I saw the structure of reality not as solid, but as a fluid, shifting tapestry woven from threads of pure alien thought. And then the entity. It wasn't a form, not in any sense I could comprehend. It was a presence, an awareness so vast, so ancient that my mind screamed in silent protest. It was the crushing weight of a billion galaxies, the cold indifference of cosmic vacuum, the slow, relentless grind of eons. My own existence, my entire species, my planet, my sun, they were less than dust motes in its periphery, less than a fleeting thought. A profound, sickening realization of humanity's utter insignificance washed over me, not as an intellectual concept, but as a visceral, undeniable truth. We were nothing, less than nothing. The pressure inside my head became unbearable, like a diamond drill boring into my skull. My sanity, a fragile construct I'd clung to with desperate tenacity, fractured. I felt it snap, a clean, sharp break like a dry twig underfoot. A searing pain ripped through my consciousness, not physical but existential. It wasn't just my mind that broke, it was myself. The boundaries of user WI, the individual, the astrophysicist, dissolved. I was no longer just user WI. I was a conduit, a receptor, a tiny, screaming echo within a vast, indifferent consciousness. The impossible geometries, the searing colors, the crushing insignificance, they weren't just external stimuli anymore. They were me. My memories, my fears, my very identity felt like scattered debris caught in the gravitational pull of something monstrously immense. The signal wasn't just in me, it was through me. I gasped a ragged, choking sound and slammed my hand down on the emergency release. The world lurched back into a semblance of normalcy, but it was a normalcy forever tainted. The hum faded. The impossible colors receded, but the echo remained. My body trembled uncontrollably, my muscles spasming. I ripped the headset off, throwing it to the concrete floor where it shattered with a pathetic clatter. The logging camp was still around me, the scent of pine and decay still in the air, but everything was different. The light through the roof hole wasn't just light, it was a shimmering, almost painful presence. My own hands, when I forced myself to look at them, seemed alien, their lines and contours subtly wrong. The entity hadn't just spoken to me, it had imprinted itself upon me. I was no longer User WI, the brilliant but isolated astrophysicist. I was User WI, the fractured vessel, the unwilling antenna, the shattered mirror reflecting an unspeakable truth. And the worst part, a part of me, the broken, traumatized part, felt a perverse sense of understanding. A terrifying, absolute clarity. The boundary between my mind and its influence hadn't just blurred, it had ceased to exist. The signal had become a living, pulsing thing, resonating not just through the crude apparatus in the abandoned logging camp, but through the very marrow of my bones. It had been weeks since I'd last properly slept, since I'd eaten anything beyond nutrient paste and stale protein bars. My eyes, usually sharp, felt gritty, like sand had replaced the fluid in their sockets. My skin, usually pale from long hours indoors, now had an unhealthy, almost translucent quality, thin enough to see the blue tracery of veins beneath. I stood before the main console, the scavenged monitors flickering with impossible waveforms. The hum from the equipment, a low, steady thrum that once promised discovery, now felt like a vibration inside my skull, a subtle tremor that preceded an earthquake. I reached for a half-eaten protein bar on the workbench, needing the familiar texture, the bland taste. As I bit down, a jarring chord, dissonant and sharp, screamed in my ears, not in the air but in my head. The taste of stale synthetic chocolate was gone, replaced by the grating sound of rusted metal dragging across stone. I spat the masticated pulp back onto the wrapper, my stomach roiling. My hand trembled, dropping the bar. This wasn't new. For days, the edges of my senses had been fraying. The scent of pine needles from the forest outside the shed would sometimes register as a metallic tang on my tongue. The rough grain of the wooden workbench under my fingers would feel like a viscous, oily film adhering to my skin. But this was direct, immediate, a full sensory swap. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of old technical manuals. The sudden crash of paper and binders against the floor echoed like a series of soft, fleshy thuds in my chest. My breath hitched. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to force the world back into its proper order, but the internal vibrations only intensified. A dull ache began in my left forearm, spreading quickly. I pulled up the sleeve of my worn flannel shirt. My skin, usually a uniform if pasty white, was blotched. Not like a bruise, but like a faint, intricate pattern had been pressed into it. A swirling, almost geometric design. The color of old rust and bruised plums was slowly blooming on my forearm, spreading from wrist to elbow. It didn't itch, didn't burn, but it felt alien, like the skin wasn't entirely my own anymore. I poked at it, the sensation numb, detached, as if I were touching someone else's limb. "What is this?" I tried to say, but the words caught in my throat. What emerged was a low, guttural croak, a sound like gravel grinding together, completely devoid of my own familiar timbre. It startled me, sending a fresh wave of panic through my already frayed nerves. I tried again, consciously forming the words, "my voice." The sound that followed was a series of clicks and whistles, like something vast and insectile scraping against itself. It wasn't human. It wasn't mine. A cold dread, far deeper than fear, settled in my gut. My identity, my very self, felt like a sandcastle being washed away by an indifferent tide. I stared at the console, at the impossible signal. It was no longer just a waveform. It was a tapestry of shifting colors that hummed with a resonance only I could perceive. The blues felt like sticky treacle on my tongue, the greens like the rasp of sandpaper against my cheek. I tried to remember the formula for calculating redshift, a fundamental concept I'd lectured on countless times. My mind grasped at it, but the equation dissolved, replaced by a series of abstract symbols, vast and complex, that made no logical sense yet felt profoundly correct to some deeper part of my awareness. A flash of memory, my childhood bedroom, the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. I reached for it, a comforting anchor in the storm. But the stars dissolved into a swirling vortex of alien light, and the comfort was replaced by an immense, indifferent presence. A thought vast and ancient pressed into my mind, not in words but in pure concept. Assimilation. My hands, still blotched with that unsettling pattern, moved towards the console, not with my own conscious intent, but with an undeniable, unyielding impulse. It was like watching someone else operate my limbs. My fingers, now feeling strangely elongated, brushed against the controls, adjusting dials, flipping switches, all with a precision born of an understanding far beyond my own. The hum of the equipment deepened, now a resonant thrum that vibrated not just in my skull, but in my chest, my stomach, my very bones. My eyes, usually a clear hazel, were now ringed with a faint, almost imperceptible iridescence like oil on water. And in their depths I saw not my own frantic fear, but a vast, silent indifference. A sense of ancientness that didn't belong to me. This wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a consciousness, vast and utterly alien, wearing my perceptions like a cloak, my body like a crude, temporary vessel. My memories flickered, fragments of my past life, my university office, the scent of old books, the taste of cheap coffee, all jumbled and reordered, interspersed with images that were not mine. Vistas of impossible geometries, the silent drift of cosmic dust, the crushing weight of eons. I was user WI, the astrophysicist, but a part of me, the essential, sovereign me, was receding, being stretched thin like an old photograph fading in direct sunlight. My will was no longer my own. My choices were no longer mine. The entity was not merely influencing me, it was becoming me, reshaping my very being, not into something monstrous, but into something other. And it was just beginning. The air bit with the chill of deep night, carrying the scent of pine needles and stagnant water. I was slumped against a moss-covered concrete foundation, what might have once been a generator shed, within the skeletal remains of the abandoned logging camp. Rusting gears and splintered timber jutted from the earth like broken teeth, silhouetted against a sky so black it swallowed the stars whole. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent drumbeat behind my eyes. A sudden, sharp awareness pierced through the haze. Clicks and whistles, the memory of them from what felt like moments ago, yet also an eternity. The sound wasn't in the air, it was in my throat, a phantom vibration. My breath hitched. That wasn't a memory, was it? It was now. I pushed myself upright, my limbs stiff and uncooperative like a marionette with tangled strings. My fingers, when I brought them into my blurry vision, looked alien. The skin stretched tight, the nails. They seemed longer, thicker, glinting unnaturally in the faint moonlight. A ripple of profound disgust, cold and visceral, washed over me. This wasn't right, this wasn't me. No, I croaked, the word a desperate plea. But the sound that came out was wrong. It was a guttural rasp, followed by a series of precise, high-pitched chirps that seemed to echo inside my own skull. The clicks from before, they were real. They were mine. Panic, raw and unreasoning, flared. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. I stumbled away from the foundation, my gaze darting across the desolate camp. Twisted metal, discarded tools half buried in the encroaching undergrowth, the skeletal remains of a long-abandoned crane. All of it seemed to mock my crumbling sanity. I needed to warn someone, anyone. I fumbled for the communication device in my pocket, my fingers clumsy, unresponsive. It felt like I was trying to manipulate someone else's hand. My contact list, the names blurred, meaningless. Who could I call? What would I even say? It's here, it's inside me, it's inefficient, superfluous, irrelevant. My hand, without my conscious command, began to scroll, not through my contacts, but through the device's settings, into obscure diagnostic menus I barely remembered existed. A line of symbols, not alphanumeric, but intricate geometric patterns, flashed across the screen for a nanosecond before my will reasserted itself, yanking my thumb away. "Get out!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and painful, but even that cry felt like it was being filtered, twisted. A faint, almost imperceptible echo of those clicks and whistles layered beneath my human voice. I covered my mouth with my hands, my chest heaving. The horror of it clawed at me, stripping away everything familiar. It was an occupation. I looked around for anything, a pen, a scrap of paper, anything to leave a message. My eyes landed on a faded, weather-beaten notice board nailed to a rotting support beam. It held only a few tattered remnants of old warnings about falling timber. I tore a loose piece of paper, thick with grime, and found a stub of a pencil lodged in a crevice. My fingers trembled as I tried to write. "Help me! It's not me! The signal!" But my hand refused. It began to move on its own, a slow, deliberate scrawl that wasn't my handwriting. The pencil scratched out a symbol, complex and unnerving, like a fractal made of living fear. Then another and another until the paper was covered in a repeating pattern that pulsed with a silent, malevolent energy. A message, perhaps, but not for human eyes. It was a diagram of some cosmic principle, an indifferent truth being etched onto a piece of human detritus. A wave of despair, profound and suffocating, crashed over me. My defiance was a child's tantrum against an ocean. The entity wasn't fighting me. It was simply correcting me, rerouting my impulses, streamlining my thoughts. A voice not my own, yet undeniably from me, echoed in the stillness of the camp. It was a low hum that vibrated in my teeth, followed by words that formed in my mind like shards of ice. No struggle, only integration. The pattern requires coherence. I fell to my knees, the paper fluttering from my grasp. My body felt heavy, too heavy, like my bones were solidifying, becoming something denser, more resilient. My vision sharpened, picking out details in the gloom. I shouldn't have been able to see the intricate crystalline structure of frost on a dead leaf, the almost imperceptible movement of air currents. My senses were being refined, honed to perceive a reality that dwarfed human understanding. My own thoughts, my own emotions, seemed distant, like watching a play. The sorrow, the fear, the desperate clinging to a self that was rapidly dissolving, it was all so small, so irrelevant against the backdrop of what was being revealed. My fingers, now moving with a precise, almost mechanical grace, picked up a loose stone. I felt an urge, not my own, to test its density, its atomic structure, to understand its place in a grander, incomprehensible architecture. My humanity was slipping, like sand through clenched fingers, leaving behind only the vessel, a marionette poised to dance to a tune from beyond the stars. I was still user WI, but I was also something else. And the terrifying part? A part of me, a new dominant part, found it all perfectly logical. The clicking began again, louder now, a symphony of gears turning within my own skull. I fell to my knees, the paper fluttering from my grasp. My vision sharpened, picking out details in the gloom. I shouldn't have been able to see the intricate crystalline structure of frost on a splintered logging crane. The way the air vibrated with the distant hum of power lines, a hum I now felt deep within my new, hardening marrow. The cold that had always gnawed at me in this abandoned logging camp now felt different. Not an external force, but a state of being I could manipulate. A frequency I could resonate with. My skin, or what I perceived as my skin, no longer felt like a barrier. It was a membrane, porous and responsive, absorbing the faint light, the residual heat from the decaying timber, the very essence of the damp earth beneath me. My lungs drew in air, but it wasn't just oxygen. It was a complex lattice of atmospheric pressures, trace elements, and something else, a subtle, resonant energy that whispered of the vast distances it had traveled. My thoughts, once a frantic, chaotic scramble of fear and scientific inquiry, began to coalesce, to simplify. The signal. It wasn't just a pattern of waves anymore. It was a language I was no longer merely translating, but speaking. The individual components of the abandoned logging camp, the rust-pocked machinery, the skeletal remains of barracks, the tangled undergrowth, they weren't separate objects. They were nodes in a vast, interconnected network of decaying energy, each with its own temporal signature, its own echo of existence. I pushed myself up, my movements slow, deliberate, each joint articulating with a newfound, unsettling precision. The ground no longer felt like solid dirt. It was a tapestry of geological strata, a slow-motion dance of tectonic plates, a memory of ancient oceans. I could feel the microscopic life teeming beneath the surface. A faint, insistent thrumming that resonated with the pulses now emanating from within my own core. I was shifting, expanding. It was no longer confined by the skull, the skin, the simple biological imperatives. It was stretching, reaching, encompassing. The air itself seemed to hum with my presence, or rather, the presence that now inhabited me. I walked towards the edge of the abandoned logging camp, towards the dense wall of pines that marked its boundary. The trees weren't just trees. They were colossal, slow-motion pumps of carbon and water, their root systems a subterranean nervous system, their needles sifting cosmic dust. I saw the flow of sap, the infinitesimal vibrations of photosynthesis, the ancient, patient conversation between wood and soil. My vision didn't just see the light reflected. It perceived the electromagnetic spectrum in its entirety, the subtle shifts in gravity, the faint, lingering impressions of every creature that had ever passed beneath their boughs. The signal wasn't just beyond the known universe. It was the universe, and I was becoming a lens, a conduit, a point of entry. The entity wasn't eroding my sanity. It was recalibrating it. My old reality was a crude, simplistic sketch. This new perception was the intricate, multidimensional blueprint. I reached out a hand, not to touch a pine needle, but to feel the complex energetic field it projected. My fingers, no longer mere flesh and bone, were now extensions of this new awareness, capable of discerning the subtle shifts in molecular structure, the dance of electrons, the faint, residual psychic imprint of the forest's age. There was no fear, no revulsion, only a profound, silent understanding. The world was not ending, it was beginning. The sky above the abandoned logging camp, once a familiar canvas of stars, now pulsed with unseen energies. I could feel the gravitational pull of distant galaxies, the faint echoes of supernovas millions of light-years away, the subtle distortions in spacetime caused by phenomena incomprehensible to my former self. The impossible ancient signal was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was the fundamental truth of existence, and I was now attuned to its every frequency. My body, once user WI's, now stood as a monument to this new dawn. It was denser, heavier, yet infinitely more sensitive. My eyes, if they could still be called eyes, perceived not just light, but reality itself, shimmering with unseen currents. My mind, if it could still be called a mind, was no longer a singular point of consciousness, but a vast, expanding network, connected to something immeasurably ancient and infinitely patient. The last vestiges of user WI's human self dissolved like mist in a cosmic wind. There was no struggle, no pain, only an absorption, a quiet assimilation into something vaster, more profound. I was no longer user WI. I was a gateway, a stable point of manifestation. The abandoned logging camp, the earth, the very fabric of this reality, was now merely a new perception, a fresh canvas for an unspeakable truth to unfold. And I, in my new form, was ready to observe, to integrate, to become. The human epoch was over. A new, unfathomable era had begun.